Comrades, picture this. There is a quiet stretch of river in the northeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. It is the Tumen River, narrow and shallow, which originates on the Chinese side of Mount Paektu and runs east for 15 final kilometers as the border between Russia and the Kimdom then enters the Sea of Japan. Just upstream sits a single rust-streaked rail bridge, the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge, built by Soviet engineers in 1959, an old gift from one ideological elder brother to the youngster. Now, 415 meters downstream from that old bridge, a new structure sits across the same river. It is called the Khasan-Tumangang Bridge, and it is, by almost any ordinary engineering measure, an unremarkable achievement costing only about $100 million. It is scheduled to open on June 19, 2026, exactly 2 years to the day after our respected Supreme Leader and Vladimir Putin signed their comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in Pyongyang. And this geopolitical move pissed off China greatly. Yes, our respected Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un is playing a 4D geopolitical chess game. Ostensibly, the three countries of Russia, China, and North Korea get along very well. Their leaders cheer in front of the camera, attending each other's military parades, and have signed treaties to build comprehensive strategic partnerships. The West, borrowing Bush's vocabulary, might call it a triangle of evil. China is North Korea's economic lifeline. Russia is North Korea's food supplier. And Pyongyang, as always, serves as a strategic barrier against the capitalist fake Korea. However, under the friendly and fatherly smiles, political charades are being played. China has long wanted something from this tiny corner of Northeast Asia, a practical route from Jilin province to the Sea of Japan through the lower Tumen. It is not a map-making fantasy, but China envisioned it as a real outlet for cargo, regional development, and strategic depth. And Beijing has kept negotiating the issue with Russia and North Korea. Political meetings in May 2024, and as recent as May 21, 2026, all referred to continued dialogue over Chinese rights over the Tumen River estuary. However, the recently completed Khasan-Tumangang Bridge is only 9 meters high and neatly blocks all commercial cargo ships from passing. In this episode, we explore how one small bridge over the Tumen River reveals the quiet distrust inside the China, Russia, and North Korea triangle. From China's century-old dream of reaching the Sea of Japan, to Putin's wartime dependence on Kim Jong-un, to the newly found Russia-North Korea friendship that may accidentally bury Beijing's ambitions. This is the story of how three friendly dictatorships smile for the camera, then fight over a muddy river behind the scenes. Before we go further, comrades, a small ritual. This channel exists because of your loyal patrons, who financially enable us to conduct full-length research. You deserve all the praises and blessings. Thank you sincerely. Now buckle up, let's dig in.
It seems intended to demonstrate the strengthening of North Korea and China's socialist solidarity as a form of counterbalance to the South Korea-US-Japan trilateral framework. Another aspect for Chairman Kim is to show he plays a key role within the North Korea-China-Russia alignment.
To understand why one cheap road bridge made Beijing so uncomfortable, we should look at the river itself. The Tumen River is about 500 kilometers long, born near Mount Paektu, flowing east through the cold borderlands of Northeast Asia, separating China and North Korea for most of its journey. Right before reaching the sea, it commits a great geopolitical betrayal. The final 15 kilometers become the border between North Korea and Russia. You can literally stand in the upstream Chinese villages, look down at the ocean, but cannot touch the final gate. It matters greatly. If history had been slightly less cruel, northeastern China would have had its own natural maritime outlet. Hunchun could have become a gateway city. Nearby cities could have sent cargo directly eastward instead of dragging everything south toward Dalian or renting access through Russian and North Korean ports. Nonetheless, geopolitics does not believe the Chinese tears. The current problem dates back to the 19th century, when the Qing dynasty suddenly became an old, decaying empire surrounded by newer, much stronger empires. In 1860, Russia forced the Qing court to sign the Convention of Peking, which allowed Russia to take the lands east of the Ussuri River and north of the lower Tumen. This was the territory that would give Russia its Pacific foothold, including its warm Far East port, Vladivostok. China, still having most of the Tumen River, lost its direct access to the sea. The Qing dynasty was weak, corrupt, but not foolish, and could still recognize basic geography. In 1886, the Qing official Wu Da-chung, representing the declining empire, negotiated with Russia over the border around Hunchun. It was more like asking the burglar, very politely, whether he could at least leave the front door unlocked after taking the house. As expected, Wu did not reverse the loss of territory or find any new coastline. But his effort made a historical claim about China's right of passage to the Sea of Japan. In the early 20th century, Chinese fishing ships did take the Tumen route. According to Hunchun County records, in 1929, nearly 1,500 vessels passed through the river. In 1931, the recorded number was 1,383. These were not giant container ships, obviously. Nobody was sending an oceanic supercarrier through a shallow border river in Manchuria. But the route was functioning, at the very least benefiting the fishermen in catching some Arctic king crabs. Although not entirely owned by China, the river connected Hunchun north toward Vladivostok and south toward the Korean peninsula. Then, 1938 was the year of strangulation. Japan and the Soviet Union clashed near Lake Khasan. Japanese forces placed obstacles in the Tumen River to prevent Soviet movement along the waterway. Later, as war deepened, concrete blocks and other barriers further strangled the passage. And like many things in East Asia, temporary wartime measures often became permanent historical problems. After 1949, the new People's Republic of China inherited the loss of territory and the physically damaged river. The situation was even more delicate. The lower river was controlled by two socialist comrades, North Korea and the Soviet Union. It sounds nice until you realize comrades are more capable of ruining your strategic interests than enemies. In 1959, 6 years after the Korean War armistice, the Soviet Union commissioned the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge across the Tumen River. Officially, it was a symbol of socialist solidarity. The name alone is almost too perfect. Friendship Bridge. Because nothing says friendship like a low railway bridge placed across the river route your giant neighbor has wanted to use for decades. It connected North Korea and Russia's Siberia. But for China, the 623-meter-long bridge was only 8 meters high, too low for any cargo ship. That's right. North Korea and Russia were deliberately pissing off China. At first, they built a temporary bridge as a wartime logistics route for military and reconstruction support. But gradually, Moscow realized that building a permanent bridge was a very convenient strategy. Since the 19th century, Russia's Far Eastern policy has had one very consistent goal: to keep China away from the Pacific coastline at the Tumen mouth and have direct contact with Korea. The Sino-Soviet relationship had been deteriorating since 1956, and this ideological split became more visible shortly afterward. Moscow and Beijing were still officially comrades, but the brotherhood was developing cracks. China hated the Soviet national de-Stalinization and the idea of international peaceful coexistence with the Western Bloc, which Chairman Mao decried as revisionism. On the other hand, in 1956, the August faction incident had shaken North Korean politics. Pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese figures challenged Kim Il-sung's leadership, and Kim responded with bloody purges. The incident deepened the great leader's suspicion of outside interference, especially from the two socialist giants who both believed they had the right to advise him on how to run his own little revolutionary kingdom. So, after the Chinese army withdrew from North Korea in 1958, Nikita Khrushchev and Kim Il-sung shook hands and pointed to Mao Zedong as the least desirable comrade. The bridge was thus built, and they successfully hurt China's geopolitical interest and did some emotional damage. A low rail bridge across a shallow river means large vessels cannot pass. Even if China still had a legal right to navigate, the right became almost useless in practice. And now China can only borrow access through Russian and North Korean ports. It was built legally and protected Russia's Far East from China's encroachment. What a geopolitical chess move!
Kim Il-sung was on a visit to China. He talked with Chairman Mao Zedong in an atmosphere of brotherly friendship.
Russia, China, and North Korea. These three authoritarian regimes have never been natural allies, and each has its own petty interests. In March 1969, on a frozen island in the Ussuri River, a Chinese People's Liberation Army patrol ambushed Soviet border guards in a planned operation that killed dozens on both sides and brought the two socialist giants to the brink of nuclear war. By August of that year, Soviet diplomats in Washington were openly discussing with American counterparts the possibility of a nuclear strike on Chinese facilities. Beijing began evacuating its leadership and digging tunnel networks under its northern cities. Mao concluded he could not fight America and Russia at the same time, and within 3 years, Henry Kissinger was eating Peking duck in the People's Great Hall. Then, the entire late Cold War play was developed upon the death of the Sino-Soviet friendship. Russia and China have never been friends, except for a short honeymoon period after the PRC's founding. For Russia, the Far East is enormous, resource-rich, but at the same time underpopulated and geopolitically insecure. Across the border sits China, with a much larger population. To make things worse, China is resentful toward its century of humiliation and the so-called unequal treaties that transferred the Amur and Ussuri regions to the Russian Empire. As recently as 2004, the two countries were still finalizing the last island transfers along their shared border. Russian nationalists, including Vladimir Zhirinovsky's wing of the political right, denounced even the modest concessions as a sellout. But Chinese officials still privately refer to the taken territories in the language one uses for asking friends to kindly return the borrowed money. The demographic asymmetry is China's biggest advantage. The Russian Far Eastern Federal District holds about 6.25 million people, scattered across an area larger than India. Across the border, in the three Manchurian provinces of Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, live roughly 110 million Chinese. Now, Mother Russia has been stuck in a forever special military operation, and its declining global power just exacerbated Moscow's fear of becoming Beijing's junior partner. Regardless of Putin's feelings, to get into the Chinese market and to have China's diplomatic support, Siberia would slowly become an economic appendage of northeast China. Russian leaked FSB documents reported in 2024 made the underlying anxiety explicit, identifying Chinese intelligence infiltration and demographic creep as a strategic threat, even as the two countries publicly described their partnership as having no limits. Now, slide North Korea into this awkward room. In a similar logic, Pyongyang did not want China to gain too much influence in its northeastern frontier either. The Kimdom has always depended on larger patrons, but is also afraid of being swallowed. The great leader survived by playing China and the Soviet Union against each other. When the Soviet subsidy was generous, he leaned toward the Soviet. When Beijing was useful, he praised the Chinese. When either side became too demanding, the leader suddenly rediscovered the sacred national doctrine of Juche, which in practice meant, please send more aid, but do not tell us what to do. Our dear leader, Kim Jong-il, continued the pattern with less elegance and more famine. Beijing's relationship with Pyongyang has always been less a fraternal bond than a strategic burden, a buffer state held in place because the alternative, a unified Korea allied with the United States, is much worse. So, counterintuitively, Beijing's post-Cold War support was never the same as Soviet-style patronage. Until the collapse of the USSR, North Korea enjoyed the great privilege of having subsidized Russian oil and exporting its products to the Eastern Bloc at a higher, friendly rate. In contrast, after the Soviet Union's collapse, China was busy with its market reform and apparently didn't bail out North Korea out of 90s deadly famine. Beijing kept viewing North Korea's nuclear program as a major threat to regional stability. The Chinese communist leaders, especially Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, surprisingly went against their tradition of non-interference and took on a proactive mediator role, resulting in the establishment of the six-party talks for the peaceful denuclearization of the peninsula. Then what? Thanks, but no thanks. The dear leader said the Korean people believed in the idea of Juche self-reliance. In October 2006, right after Beijing explicitly warned them that a nuclear test would be a terrible idea, Kim Jong-il gave China a generous 20-minute heads-up before detonating their first nuclear device. Nothing says, "We respect your regional leadership," quite like setting off an atomic bomb right next to your border, with virtually no warning in advance. At the same time, North Korea consistently demanded economic support from China, essentially blackmailing Beijing, saying, "If you stop feeding us, our government will collapse, millions of refugees will flood into your border towns, and the US Army will set up a base next door. All right, your move." China was fed up with this nuclear BS and finally decided to join the West. In 2016, after a North Korean nuclear test, China's foreign ministry said Beijing was firmly opposed and urged Pyongyang to stop actions that worsened the situation. Then there were rounds of UN sanctions. In 2017, Resolution 2371 banned North Korean exports of coal, iron ore, seafood, lead, and lead ore, while Resolution 2375 banned textile exports and restricted petroleum products. Beijing enforced these sanctions and cut North Korean exports to China by an estimated 88% in a single year. Deservedly, the North Korean economy sank to rock bottom, and its people experienced another round of famine and hardship around 2018. In doing so, President Xi earned a degree of resentment from the supreme leader that Western analysts have consistently underestimated. I mean, it's not really China's fault. I bet you wouldn't be happy either if your naughty little brother kept secretly messing up with A-bombs. So, since the respected supreme leader Kim Jong-un took power in 2011, he punished China by avoiding it. He did not visit Beijing. Xi Jinping did not visit him. For 7 years, the leader of China and the leader of his only formal treaty ally refused to be in the same room. The freeze broke only in late March 2018, when our respected supreme leader rolled into Beijing in his bulletproof train ahead of his Singapore summit with Trump, looking for advice and cover. The Russia-DPRK relationship has historically not been good either. The Soviet big brother did a fair job, kept North Korea's industrial fantasy running, providing all oils, technicians, and export markets. However, in the 80s, Gorbachev wanted to normalize Soviet relations with the outside world. Then, South Korean President Roh Tae-woo launched Nordpolitik, designed to reach out to North Korea's old communist friends, especially the Soviet Union and China. It was a diplomatic poaching. If Seoul could build relations with Moscow and Beijing, Pyongyang would lose its economic lifeline, as well as support from the UN Security Council. On September 30, 1990, the Soviet Union and South Korea established diplomatic relations. It was a practical move for Moscow. South Korea had money, technology, investment, and access to global finance. North Korea had debt, demands, ideology, and a talent for making every relationship feel like hostage negotiation. Easy choice, isn't it? But for Pyongyang, this was humiliation in its purest form. The new Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin even went further, since Russians wanted Western loans, capitalist legitimacy, and a seat at the new global order. The Yeltsin government shut down aid and subsidized trades, and suddenly the Juche doctrine of self-reliance could not rescue a country from darkness. Fuel supplies fell, fertilizer production suffered, agriculture broke down. Then Kim Il-sung died in 1994, and the Kimdom entered the Great Famine, remembered as the Arduous March. Things got slightly better when Putin was on the chessboard, who tried to restore some of the old Soviet influence. He visited North Korea in 2000, the first Russian leader ever to do so. Moscow and Pyongyang signed a new friendship treaty, but this was not a return to the old Soviet security guarantee. The old automatic military alliance was gone. The new relationship was more cautious, more transactional, and much weaker. It meant that Russia would not become North Korea's nuclear lawyer. In 2006 and again in 2016, Moscow joined Beijing at the UN Security Council, condemning Pyongyang's nuclear tests and voting for sanctions. So, you got me. It is the impossible authoritarian triangle which Russia, China, and North Korea can never be friends with each other at the same time. They all have their own agenda. China wants regional leadership, which unwittingly suggests a better, wider demarcated border and more resources from the Arctic Circle. North Korea wants A-bombs to secure the Kim dynasty while not letting all of its subjects die of hunger. Russia wants to hold its resourceful Far East for its oligarchs and has the past international prestige of the Soviet Union. Russia and China may get along, and they together denounce North Korea for its nuclear test. China and North Korea could be friends, but Russia turned to South Korea for financial capital. Now, China has become a geopolitical pillar, So Russia and North Korea went hand in hand for some dangerous charade.
The holiday photo call. Every leader does one. No one else does them shirt off, fish in hand. Welcome to Vladimir Putin's summer break in Siberia. These state pictures designed to boost the president's popularity, the strongman image central to his sky-high ratings among Russian people. He found time for open water swimming in the freezing mountain lake, driving machines at speed, and spearfishing. A Kremlin spokesman quoted as saying the president chased a particular pike for 2 hours before, of course, snaring it.
Frankly, the Northeast Asia power dynamics were somewhat a draw during the 2000s. The downside of China's economic boom was its reliance on foreign oil, gas, and other resources. And basically all civilized geopolitical talks were essentially around the Siberian energy pipeline. In March 2006, during Putin's visit to China, the two countries' energy executives signed a memorandum on Russian gas deliveries to China. There were two possible routes. One was the western route, often called the Altai route, taking gas from western Siberia into Xinjiang. The other was the eastern route, eventually developed into what we now call Power of Siberia, bringing gas from eastern Siberian fields toward northeast China. Russia had gas, China had demand, and both hated being lectured by the West. What could possibly go wrong? The problem, as always, was price. Russia wanted China to pay something close to European prices. At the time, Europe was Gazprom's golden cow. European customers bought huge volumes under long-term contracts on a fluctuating price system, and they accounted for around 40% of Gazprom's revenue up to 2014. China, naturally, looked at this and said, very politely, absolutely not. Beijing did not want to become Europe's number two, but demanded a friendly discount, preferably one large enough to make Russian officials smile painfully through the signing ceremony. The negotiations dragged on for years. Russia had resources, but China had time. In December 2009, Chinese leader Hu Jintao inaugurated the Central Asia-China gas pipeline with the leaders of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, which brought Turkmen gas through Central Asia into Xinjiang. And this chess move changed the entire negotiation. Beijing did not turn down Moscow's offer, but it could now casually sit and wait for Russia to commit its own geopolitical mistakes. Then came 2014. Russia annexed Crimea. The West imposed sanctions. Moscow suddenly needed a grand Asian breakthrough, something large enough to show Europe and America that Russia could simply turn east. And there, waiting patiently, was President Xi Jinping. In May 2014, Russia and China finally signed the 30-year Power of Siberia gas deal, commonly reported as worth around $400 billion. Under the agreement, Russia would eventually supply China with 38 billion cubic meters of gas per year, and actual deliveries began in December 2019. It is China's strategy. Beijing is not robbing Mother Russia, apparently. The Chinese just have to wait until Russia's Western position weakens and the gas business becomes a buyer's market. Still, this relationship was balanced. Russia was weaker than China economically, but not yet cornered, since Europe still depended on cheap Russian energy. Moscow could still dream of being a bridge between Europe and Asia, rather than a sanctioned raw material annex of Beijing. Then came 2022. Russia started to bleed in Ukraine, and the Euro-Asian chess game became overwhelmingly one-sided. With all international sanctions, China declared itself a true lover and did not abandon Russia. Of course not. That would be wasteful. Beijing even bought more Russian energy. President Xi wanted Russia weakened, but not defeated. A collapsed Russia would turn Siberia into a giant nuclear yard sale, a potential nightmare for global order. China wants Putin alive enough to distract the West, sell cheap oil, and support China at the UN. However, Putin, instead of becoming more dependent on China, did something that made Beijing uncomfortable to create political leverage. The supposed bear-riding strongman went shopping in Pyongyang. This seemed pathetic at first. Russia, the country that once built half the military hardware of the world, was now asking the Kimdom for artillery shells. Think about it. It actually makes sense. For decades, Pyongyang had prepared for a war on the Korean peninsula that never came. It had old stockpiles and factories that could produce shells and magazines without ever consulting any international law. Most importantly, under the Supreme Leader's loving care, the Kimdom can mobilize everyone, and the country has no reputation left to lose. This strategic pivot accelerated in 2023. In September that year, our respected Supreme Leader traveled to Russia's Vostochny Cosmodrome to meet Vladimir Putin in front of a rocket launch pad. Within months, the relationship moved from photo ops to dirty transactions. By 2024, two regimes had built a wartime supply network economically life-saving for Pyongyang. Coal, seafood, textiles, weapons. Russia welcomed all the restricted or monitored North Korean goods. And Beijing grudgingly realized that Kim Jong-un had a new, independent cash flow that they could not control. On June 19, 2024, Putin arrived in Pyongyang and signed the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Article 4 states that if either country is placed into a state of war by armed invasion, the other side is supposed to provide military and other assistance with all means at its disposal. Then, you know what happened next. So, Kim Jong-un could provide what Xi Jinping would not by delivering the dirty goods and disposable Korean lives to the front line. Russia suddenly found North Korea very useful. Putin had this epiphany of joining Kim Jong-un to become a supervillain, creating leverage to blackmail Beijing for more generous economic support.
Plenty of business deals being done at the APEC meeting. Russia's Gazprom has signed a new deal to supply gas to China worth more than $300 billion. It's the second major gas supply agreement between the two countries done this year. The deal a boost for Russian President Vladimir Putin, whose regime has been under fire for its involvement in the Ukraine crisis.
All of these bring us back to that troubled water, the Tumen River. Despite the loss of territory, China has never completely given up its right to navigate through the lower Tumen into the Sea of Japan. In 1990, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, China organized a symbolic expedition, with boats sailing down the river as a scientific survey, as well as a political message. In international law, there is a doctrine called tacit abandonment, the silent surrender of a right through prolonged failure to exercise or assert it. The cruel logic of tacit abandonment is that international law does not ask why you stayed silent. It does not care that you were busy with a civil war, or a famine, or a nuclear program, or, in China's case, with becoming the second largest economy in the world. It only asks whether you protested, whether you exercised the right, whether you treated it as a right at all. If you did not, you cannot suddenly declare your rights or ownership. That's the reason behind China's consistent protests and sporadic passages. In May 1991, China and the Soviet Union signed the agreement on the eastern section of the China-Soviet boundary. The agreement settled major parts of the long Sino-Soviet border dispute, and in the Tumen section, it recognized Chinese navigation through the lower river. The Chinese version of Article 9 stated that, After agreement with the relevant parties, Chinese vessels flying the Chinese flag could navigate along the Tumen River below the specified boundary point to reach the sea and return. But sadly, it was just a right on a piece of paper. The final stretch of the river is the Russia-North Korea border. So even if Moscow nodded, Pyongyang still mattered. Even if Pyongyang nodded, there was the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge lying low, physically denying the passage of any commercial ship from China. Facing the difficulty, Beijing gradually developed a workaround called the external transport of domestic cargo. The logic was simple. Cargo from China's northeast could be moved through foreign ports, especially Vladivostok in Russia and Rason in North Korea, while being treated under Chinese customs arrangements as a controlled domestic movement. It helped China to develop its regional economy, while a large chunk of the profit was swallowed by Russia and the DPRK, from whom Chinese cargo has to rent space, routes, and facilities. So, the blockage of the Tumen estuary has earned great leverage for Moscow and Pyongyang, and therefore Putin and Kim Jong-un have every reason to keep the river technically negotiable, but practically unusable. Jump forward to May 2024, and the situation seemingly developed in favor of China. Putin visited Beijing, and China and Russia issued a long joint statement marking the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Buried in the economic cooperation section was one sentence that caused enormous excitement. The two sides would conduct constructive dialogue with North Korea on the issue of Chinese vessels navigating through the lower reaches of the Tumen River to the sea. The implication seemed obvious. China and Russia had reached some level of understanding, and the remaining problem was the supreme leader Kim. This looked like a breakthrough for President Xi. Chinese commentaries became very optimistic. Some imagined dredging the channel, while others discussed raising or modifying the old friendship blockage bridge. People began talking, once again, about China's long-delayed access to the Sea of Japan. The old dream came back wearing a new diplomatic suit. But then came the cruel joke. Only weeks later, Putin flew to Pyongyang and signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty with Kim Jong-un. And during that same period, Russia and North Korea moved forward with the agreement to build a new road bridge across the Tumen. It was not a bridge designed to help Chinese navigation, but an even lower road bridge, further obstructing the already well-obstructed river. The construction began on April 30th, 2025. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin described the project as a symbol of strengthened Russia-North Korea cooperation. A year later, North Korea and Russia connected the bridge spans. The new road bridge over the Tumen was expected to open soon, with completion targeted for June 19, 2026, and a capacity for roughly 300 vehicles a day. Officially, all very normal. It's all about trades and friendship. But everyone knows Russian engineers do not specify deck heights 1 meter below an existing bridge by accident. North Korean officials do not approve such specifications without instructions. The bridge's height was, almost certainly, dictated to annoy President Xi Jinping. And this time, international law is perhaps not in China's favor. If Beijing sues at the International Court of Justice, opposing counsel will simply produce satellite imagery of the bridge, the date of construction, and the absence of Chinese protest at the bridge specifications during the design period of 2024 to 2025. The doctrine of tacit abandonment will write itself. This is what makes the Tumen Bridge such an elegant piece of authoritarian infrastructure. It is small, cheap, useful, and structurally devastating. It costs Russia and North Korea almost nothing and creates enormous political leverage. During Putin's recent visit to Beijing in 2026, the new joint statement did not announce a breakthrough on navigation. It did not speak directly about the bridge problem. The two sides went back to legal language and explicitly invoked Article 9 of the May 16, 1991 border agreement. Diplomats said they would continue, together with North Korea, the trilateral consultation process on the Tumen outlet. In other words, as of May 2026, Beijing still had not obtained a corridor, but got another promise of future negotiation. Whenever Beijing wants to turn that paper right into a usable corridor, Russia can demand something in return: deference, investment, diplomatic support, or simply acceptance that the Far East remains a forever Russian property. At the same time, Kim Jong-un has partially broken China's monopoly over North Korea's survival. With the Tumen River blocked, Pyongyang is the gatekeeper of China's northeastern developments. This is the Kim dynasty's favorite business model. If there are no problems, go create some problems and justify all the sabotage in terms of Juche and national sovereignty. In this regard, the Supreme Leader Kim has been Putin's beloved teacher about the art of strategic blackmail. Admit it or not, the Northeast Asia Triangle is weirdly interesting. China is the largest and most powerful country. It has the money, the industry, the population, the engineers, the state capacity, and the very impressive ability to build a high-speed railway through mountains before a Western city can repair one escalator. But here, at this tiny river mouth, China can do nothing. That is what makes the Tumen so irritating for Beijing. The issue is not whether China can survive without this passage. Of course it can. No one would die just because they rented some warehouses and ports from Vladivostok. The Chinese economy has much bigger problems, and unfortunately for Chinese economists, most of them are not solved by a shallow river in Manchuria. But all of these are so politically humiliating. A great power does not like being told that its access to the sea depends on the mood of two weaker neighbors. A rising superpower does not enjoy watching its old treaty rights become a historical souvenir. This is a country that builds ports from Sri Lanka to Africa, but on its own frontier, still cannot persuade two supposed friends to raise a bridge. To make things worse, Russia and North Korea charge rent on that humiliation. Russia wants Chinese renminbi, but not Chinese dominance. The Far East is huge, rich, empty, and insecure. Across the border sits China, dense, hungry, patient, and historically not entirely amused by how the border was drawn. At the same time, North Korea wants Chinese lifelines, but not Chinese supervision. Kim Jong-un has built his entire foreign policy on remaining useful. He does not need to be respected in the normal sense. The Kimdom does not even need to be trusted. In fact, being trusted would probably damage the brand. The Kim dynasty survives by being unavoidable, a strategic burden that is too nuclearly dangerous to be abandoned and left alone. So, one river mouth, two bridges, three nervous neighbors. This is true international friendship, not brotherhood, not an alliance. It is a marketplace of geopolitical insecurity. Now, a small obstruction causes a new geographical problem. So next time you see Putin, Xi, and Kim standing together, smiling like three men who have discovered the future of world order, remember the Tumen River. The smiles are real enough for the cameras, but the distrust is realer in the bottom of hearts. These regimes can cooperate against the West, trade with each other, arm each other, praise each other, and still quietly sabotage each other's ambitions when the situation allows it.